here, and it's a really, actually Melbourne's such a beautiful city, I'm loving it. And thank you for having me. It's a small group, so we'll make it small, intimate, and awesome. And I will be, so basically how this is going to go, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I became a writer, and specifically about kind of how I came up with the idea for Delirium, the Delirium series. I'm touring right now for Pandemonium, which is the second book in the series. And then I am going to do a short reading from it. And then after that, I would like to take questions. And actually, questions are my favorite part of this whole experience. So I hope you will think of some and hold them in your head and save them for afterwards. And they can be about anything, my work or writing in general, which I love talking about. I actually also own a company. In addition to being a writer, I own a company that works with young writers. So I feel very well prepared to talk about that kind of thing. Or anything you want, New York, Brooklyn, whatever strikes your fancy. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I became a writer. I've been writing for basically my whole life. I started writing actually kind of as a version of fan fiction, which we didn't have a name for at the time because we did not have the internet. But when I was little, my writing and my reading have always been really intertwined. And I think that you can't, in fact, be a good writer unless you're also a really eager and good reader. And by good, I just mean basically eager. And you know, you just have to consume a lot of material, and that's how you learn a lot about writing. When I was really young, the first books that I kind of fell in love with, I remember when they ended, I'd feel really sad. I'd feel as though this world that I had helped create and imagine had been taken from me. And so my earliest attempts at writing were really just kind of writing sequels and spin-off stories to some of the books I loved. For example, C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, also the Redwall series, which I don't know if you have here. Actually, I then realized that all of those books have like 87 sequels each, so the authors didn't need any help from me, an 8-year-old. But I felt as though I still feel as though that's a really good way to start writing. Now there are whole communities of obviously people who write like Harry Potter pornography, but I do think that's a good thing, not the Harry Potter pornography, but the fan fiction, because it really helps you experiment with voices, with different voices. You know, as you become a writer, you strive to develop your own voice, but sometimes that means you have to experiment a lot of different genres with a lot of different concepts first. Much like as you become an adult, you often experiment with many different identities before you figure out the one that kind of is your own. My father is also a writer, which has been deeply influential to me. He writes nonfiction books about serial killers and mass murderers, so our subject matter is a little bit different. But from him I learned the incredibly valuable advice to write every day, and I think that's actually the most important advice you can learn or know as a writer. Writing is really hard. One of the most common questions I get is, what do you do when you have writer's block? And to be honest, I feel as though I have writer's block every day. But I've trained myself through years of writing every day to really be able to fall back on my discipline. And when I don't absolutely have to be doing something else, I am writing. And that means that, you know, I'm by the age, you know, I'm 29 and I'm writing my 7th book right now for publication. So that's really the way that you can really develop a lot of material. I don't even write that much every day. I just do it consistently. So I really encourage any young writers in here to start developing that habit early. I actually always tell this story, but I wrote my first book, Before I Thaw, which is not short by any means. While I was a full-time graduate student, I had a full-time job, and I also had a part-time job at a nightclub. And the only time that I had was on the subway commuting to and from commitments. And so I wrote it actually on my BlackBerry and then would email sections to myself when I got out of the subway. And that's why I have really no sympathy for people who say that they don't have time to write. Because, I mean, you know, you can always find the time. So I didn't study writing in school. It's not totally necessary. I didn't study it in college. I studied philosophy. But I did go to a college that placed a great emphasis on reading. And again, I mean, not to hit it too hard, but that's really what you need to be able to do if you want to be a writer. And I did find out after school. So I graduated with a degree in philosophy and literature, which of course meant that I became a waitress. And then after doing that for several years, I found out that you could get a graduate degree that you'd be paid for, basically. They would pay you or pay for you to go to school for 2 years and study writing, which was awesome. So I did. I moved back to New York. I went to NYU and I studied writing for 2 full years. And there I learned also another important thing, both for writing and for life, which is when to take criticism and when to reject it. It's really important to know when to internalize. Like, you have to take edits as a writer. You need to know when to internalize it, and you need to know when to say F you. So that's really what I learned from my graduate program. I didn't learn, however, how to plot a book, how to tell a story. I was writing these long, I also always tell this story, but when I was in graduate school, I wrote this 800-page novel and then rewrote it from page 1, which meant that I actually wrote 1,600 pages in which not a single interesting thing happened, which is really actually mathematically improbable, and I'm kind of proud of. That I learned from, the plotting I learned from actually when I became an editor myself. I got a job working at Penguin Books, and I got a job in their young adult department. Really a kind of literature I knew nothing about. They didn't really have it when I was growing up. And so that's where I really learned how to tell a story, how to keep readers turning the pages. And that's where I first internalized like the last piece of advice I could tell you, which is just that books need plots. I mean, books are about telling stories. That's why people write them. That's why people read them. And so it was there that I started working on my first book, Before I Fall, which is optioned to be a movie, by the way, as is the Delirium series, so keep your fingers crossed. And I will talk specifically, I mean, if you have any questions about Before I Fall, you can ask later, but I will talk specifically about the Delirium trilogy and kind of how I came up with the idea. Because, again, for people who are interested in writing, I think it's really good to be in practice of trying to think of how you come up with an idea for a book, and then take that into, a full fleshed out form. Delirium is about a world in which love is treated as a contagious disease, and scientists have figured out how to cure it. And the idea came from 2 places. The idea came from, one, again, my reading. One of my favorite authors, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, said that every good book is about love or death. In my first book, the main character dies 7 times, essentially, in a car crash. So I thought I'd really hit the death theme a little bit hard, and I should back up off that. So I started thinking about writing a book about love and what that would mean. And then several days later, and I just allowed that to kind of sit in my head. Several days later, I went to the gym. For some reason, all of my good ideas always come to me when I'm at the gym or in the shower. So it's another piece of advice for you, I guess. Go take lots of showers or go to the gym if you want to be a writer. And I was watching a news report, this was several years ago, and it was a news report on the swine flu or bird flu panic in New York. I don't remember which one. But it was a panic because this epidemic was supposed to kill everyone. And unfortunately and disappointingly, it didn't kill anyone. But people in New York were really panicked about that. They were clearing out all the hand sanitizer. They were showering in it and pulling their kids out of school. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the media and the government could drive you into panic over these things that ended up, and you didn't really as an individual have access to real information. You just get really frightened. And because the idea of love and the idea of epidemics kind of were combining in my head, I started thinking about if you looked at the symptoms of love and how it manifests itself, especially at first, complete inability to focus on anything other than the object of your affection, total obsessive thoughts, anxieties, periods of euphoria followed by periods of crushing depression, weight fluctuation, sleep disruption. I mean, all of those things have they all sound exactly like a psychological disorder that would be treated with Prozac in the United States. And so that's where the idea came from, and that's when I started writing Delirium. Actually, interestingly, a couple months after I started writing Delirium, there was an article in the New York Times that said that scientists had in fact isolated the chemicals responsible for making you feel that you were in love, and they speculated that in a couple years they'd be able to develop a pill that you could take if you were heartbroken or if you were in love with somebody who wasn't in love with you back to cure you of those feelings. So the science is not that far away. Delirium focuses on one character, Lena, as she, over the course of one summer, goes from believing that love is a disease, goes from wanting to be cured, to feeling as though maybe everything she's learned about not just the cure, but the whole society has been a lie. Pandemonium, the sequel, is a lot bigger. It widens the lens. And we see the growing resistance movement, and we see Lena as she becomes a warrior. One thing I should say is that Pandemonium is divided into two parts, which was really fun for me. It actually takes place in two different time frames, a then and a now. And it's actually not necessary to read Delirium before you read Pandemonium. It can stand on its own, although you do get, obviously it's a good book in its own right, but just in case you want to read it and start with the book that just came out. In the then section, we pick up right after Delirium ends, like 5 minutes after it ends. And in the now section, it takes us forward in time about 6 months until the two time frames converge. I'm going to read just from the then section, which again would be about 5 minutes after Delirium lets off. In the beginning, there is fire. Fire in my legs and lungs, fire tearing through every cell in my body. That's how I am born again, in pain. I emerge from the suffocating heat and the darkness. I force my way through a black, wet space of strange noises and smells. I run, and when I can no longer run, I limp. And when I can't do that, I crawl, inch by inch, digging my fingernails into the soil, sliding like a worm across the overgrown surface of this strange new wilderness. I bleed too when I'm born. I'm not sure how far I've traveled into the wilds and how long I've been pushing deeper into the woods when I realize I've been hit. At least one regulator must have clipped me while I was climbing the fence. A bullet has skinned me on the side, just below my armpit, and my t-shirt is wet with blood. I'm lucky though. The wound is shallow, but seeing all the blood, the missing skin makes everything real. This new place, this monstrous, massive growth everywhere, what has happened, and what I have left. What has been taken from me. There's nothing in my stomach, but I throw up anyway. I cough up into the flat, shiny leaves on either side of me. An animal coming to investigate scurries quickly back into the tangle of growth. Think of what Alex would do. Alex is here, imagine. I take off my shirt, rip off the hem, and tie the cleanest bit tightly around my chest, so it presses against my wound and helps staunch the bleeding. I have no idea where I am or where I'm going. My only thought is to move, keep going, deeper and deeper, away from the fences and the world of dogs and guns and Alex. No, Alex is here. You have to imagine. Step by step, fighting thorns, bees, mosquitoes, snapping back thick, broad branches, clouds of gnats, mist hovering in the air. At one point, I reach a river. I'm so weak, I'm nearly taken under by its current. At night, driving rain, fierce and cold. Huddled between the roots of an enormous oak, while around me unseen animals scream and pant and rattle through the darkness. I'm too terrified to sleep. If I sleep, I'll die. I am not born all at once, the new Lena. Step by step, and then inch by inch. Crawling, insides curled into dust, mouth full of the taste of smoke. Fingernail by fingernail, sliding like a worm. That is how she comes into the world, the new Lena. So that's the beginning. That's it on the kind of speech part of it. I really would love to take questions. So if you guys can, well, there's usually about a 15-second awkward pause before anybody asks the first question, but then it usually goes. So we will sit here in awkward silence for 15 seconds while you guys think of questions for me. Yes, sir.
How long does it take to write a novel?
For me, I think it depends on everybody, but for me, my novels usually take about 8 months to do a messy first draft, or a messy enough first draft, but that I can turn it into somebody else, and then between 4 and 6 months of revision. But it usually takes about a year, even after that point, before it makes it onto the shelf. So a book that's hitting Pandemonium, I finished probably a little bit, like about a year ago.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes?
In your brainstorming process, do you use a big board, or do you use bits of paper or computer? Where are your ideas?
Yeah, I brainstorm a lot in my notebook. I do brainstorm a lot by hand, although I certainly take notes on the computer. It probably, I think it depends on what stage I'm in. If it's really the beginning of the idea, then yes, I'll often scrawl by hand just because it feels, you can make lines and stuff like that. If I'm outlining, however, then I usually do that on the computer.
At what age did you decide you were a cover writer?
Well, I didn't necessarily decide I was going to become a writer. I think I always knew I would write. I always knew I would write. It always was really important to me. I didn't know that I would ever be able to make a living out of it, and that I could do it as a career. That only really started happening. It didn't really even start happening until after I sold my first book, and I made the decision to just take a risk and quit my day job. But I definitely, writing was always a part of my life. It's something I did on the side when I was doing other things, and you know, my dad always said if you can do anything else but write, you should, because writing's really hard. That's true of any artistic discipline. They're like really competitive, and it's really hard to pursue. But if you love it, you really can't do anything else. And I don't really have any other talents other than writing. So for me, there was no choice.
Okay, so being a writer myself, I find it difficult to balance my homework and writing together. So
To do what?
To balance my homework and writing together. So how did you?
I mean, probably your school won't like me for saying this, but I think that writing is equally as important to your homework. So I mean, it's really hard because everybody always has competing demands. I mean, when you're not in school, well, then you'll be in university presumably, and when you're not that, you might have a job or you might have a family. There's always things to get done, but pretty much, first of all, any amount of writing you can do every day is worth it. If you can only write 200 words, it's better than nothing, and that really should only take you, or could only take you between 15 minutes and a half an hour, and I bet you could dig it up somewhere. But like, I write on my phone in the bathroom sometimes. I leave dinner and people think I have a drug problem because I keep going to the bathroom. But if that's the only time that I can write, then that's the time I use. So you really have to kind of carve out space for it, you know? It's hard. It's always really difficult. Yes?
Out of the books you've written, what's your favorite?
Out of the books I've written, what's my favorite? Well, it's hard because I go through phases with all of my books. Like, I'll go through phases where I really hate them and can't look at them and they make me nauseous. And then I go through other phases. But it's really hard to say. Liesel and Poe means a lot to me because I wrote it after the death of my ex-boyfriend, who's my best friend. So that kind of has a lot of personal meaning to me, so it might be my favorite, but I like them all for different reasons, and I dislike them all for different reasons. Yeah.
Have you ever gotten someone saying like, oh, you copied your idea from like a different book? Or...
Well, yeah, I mean, not copied, but people will be like, oh, did you get that idea from Groundhog Day, you know, or whatever. And, you know, I mean, yeah, that stuff doesn't really bother me because there are only really, it's very rare. And the truth is, there are only really about 7 stories in the world, but there's an infinite amount of ways to tell those same stories. Like, forbidden love is one trope, it's one story. And, you know, but you can tell that story in so many different ways, and it's been done in ways from, you know, Shakespeare to Stephanie Meyers. So, it's the same thing with a piano. There's only a certain amount of keys, but there's an infinite amount of ways to play them, so, you know. Yes, and you. Well, whichever. You first.
Okay, how do you come up with like, the title and the cover for your books?
Well, writers don't come up with the covers. Actually, we don't have any say over that. We are allowed to have approval, but that really doesn't mean anything. If you hate a cover, if you absolutely despise it, they might change it. But you really don't. It's an art department at the publishing house that really does that. Same thing, Liesel and Poe's illustrated, and I didn't get to pick the illustrator. I was very happy. I've been very happy with my covers, but you don't have as much control as you like. The titles, some authors are great at titling. I'm notoriously horrible at it. I've never titled a single one of my books. Actually, Pandemonium and the 3rd book, Requiem, which comes out next year, were both all titled by fans on my blog. I actually literally asked the fans, I was like, hey, can you give me ideas for titles? You know, and they never read them, but they wrote with these great titles that totally worked after Delirium. So now I've decided to start outsourcing all of my work to my fans and having them write my books for me. The question was about my habits of reading. Yeah, my dad's an author. My parents are both literature professors, so we grew up in a house full of books. I mean, when I say a house full of books, I literally mean entire walls constructed of books. And I loved it. I mean, I do think that my parents' reading habits definitely influenced me. Like, my parents read at the table, my parents read at the car. So you just kind of internalize some of your parents' behaviors, but I did always read it. I still have trouble watching TV and seeing movies because for me, it's not participatory enough. Like, I guess I'm too self-absorbed because I get annoyed if I'm not necessary to the story. And if you watch TV and you leave the room, the story still plays. But with the book, it literally doesn't play unless you're participating in it. So.
First of all,
Thank you.
I am currently running the book, but most of that my life, so it's like real life. What advice would you give to people if they wanted to start writing?
I mean, again, my advice is usually always the same. I mean, nonfiction's a little bit different, and I really admire people who write nonfiction. My dad does. I can't do it. But, you know, to carve out that space for it, to make time for it every day, to start getting in the habit of making your friends and family understand that this is important to you and they need to not bug you when you're doing it. And then to read a lot. I mean, to read other people who've done similar work to what you want to do, because it does help you. I mean, you can't really develop your own story without really understanding how other stories that have been successful, and even stories that haven't been successful, have worked. I've learned just as much from novels that are bad and that I've hated as I have from good ones. Yeah?
You have a question?
Yeah.
You said about turning your books into movies. Are you worried that they didn't interpret it the way into how you wanted them to?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question.
They're turning your books into movies. Aren't you worried that they might interpret it a lot differently to how you put it out there?
Well, I'm not super worried because I get to see the script and make comments on it. And also, when you sell the book, I deliberately sold it to producers who I felt really understood it and really understood kind of my vision for it. The other thing is like, I mean, it is going to be different, but I mean, it's not as though when a movie gets made, the book stops existing. Actually, in fact, usually the book sales go through the roof. So, I mean, and I wrote the book, I didn't write the movie, and I feel like even if it's not exactly what I envisioned, they are two different mediums, and they should actually be decent. My books have been translated into about 30 other languages, and I found that with translations, sometimes I have to change kind of major things in order to keep the spirit of it. So I actually think some things may have to change because it's a visual medium, but that might actually end up preserving the spirit of the piece. Does that make sense? The guy next to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you going to oversee Jim's made book, or are you going to oversee it like after what you do with the
I don't oversee it. I mean, you know, I do. I'm lucky that I chose to work with producers who are let me be hands-on. So I see the script, I talk with them about their casting choices, but it's kind of like the cover issue. I mean, ultimately they're being nice by letting me have a say, but contractually they're not obligated to. So if we really, really had some kind of difference of opinion, then they would be able to override me. Yeah.
Can you be a writer and hate reading?
Can you be a writer and hate reading? I mean, I think that depends. Like, I think that you have to have read a lot. I often don't finish books. I very rarely finish books because I am very, very picky about books. So I often get bored halfway through, or I think they're flimsy. But, you know, it's like, I use this example a lot, but it's like Picasso had to study draftsmanship before he could break all the rules. You know, you can write by subverting grammar, you can write with bad spelling, that can be deliberate choices, but you need to understand how it's done first, and reading helps you do that. So.
With Lena's friend in the class, how did you actually, was that just on purpose with the conflict, or was it like another reason?
With Lena and Hannah? What do you mean on purpose with the conflict between them?
How when they are going for their assessment, and she's like, oh, I don't want to.
Right. It wasn't deliberate. It came from understanding a lot of writing is about people and understanding how people behave. And so that was like a lot of actually when a story works, when it's working for me, it feels, and every writer will say this, it feels as though at a certain point the characters are just telling you what to do and you're just transcribing. So that kind of conflict, that kind of dialogue, I usually feel as though it's playing a movie in my head and I'm just writing down what happened. That said, conflict is at the basis of every story. Every good story has conflict kind of at its heart, because that's interesting. It's not really that interesting to watch people getting along. It is interesting to watch people, you know, pulling each other's hair and slugging each other. So, and conflict obviously can take many different forms. It doesn't have to be physical, but that is what's interesting. So I do try to find it as much as I can in every scene. Yes?
Do you have any major inspiration for the characters, the way their personalities?
I definitely, I think you put a lot of yourself into your characters. I think that novels are like dreams, and every character is kind of like you, even if it's wearing a different face. But I definitely do use details for realism. I use details of people I know. So, you know, Before I Fall, for example, there's a girl who collects cow salt shakers. And that's such a random detail, but it makes it feel real because it's so random. And my friend Lindsay in high school really did that. She was obsessed with cows. So, you know, I know, it's so weird. But like, I pull details like that and because it helps kind of flesh out and make people human. I mean, I think a problem with young writers is that they make characters seem too consistent. And real people aren't very consistent at all, and they have all these weird preferences, and they're addicted to ranch dressing, or they hate bananas, or, you know, whatever it is that makes them kind of themselves. So, but I don't like base characters on people.
Kind of similar to what you were just saying, but the like main storylines in any of your books, have you pulled from like major events in your life?
Yeah, I pull from my life, but again, they're not based on major events in my life. I mean, I've definitely, the themes in it, you know, there's themes of death. Well, I've lost people that I've been in love with, and I've had to get over that, and themes of, you know, just observational stuff, themes of people being a-holes to each other in high school. Like, you know, I went to high school too, so, you know, I definitely pull from those themes, and there's themes that are important to me, specifically themes of transformation. I've gone through radical transformation in my life. I'm really unrecognizable from the person I was when I was your age. So a lot of those things are things that mean a lot to me, but they're not, again, pulled directly from things that happen. Yes?
When you were talking about, like, fan fictions, like, my mom always says that you aren't really reading a proper book when you read fan fiction. But I think it's still considered as reading. Like, you might not be reading a proper hardcover book or anything, but it's still...
I consider it reading too, you'll be happy to know. I mean, some fan fiction's really bad, right? But I mean, some books are really bad. I mean, there are a ton of books that are published that are horrible. So, I mean, and some fan fiction's good. You know, like my fan fiction would be awesome. So I think it depends.
Has there been any like particular book or that has inspired you?
That has inspired me to do what I do? Well, I mean, I've loved a lot of authors. I mean, I love Harry Potter, but that came later in my life. I love Roald Dahl, I always loved. I love To Kill a Mockingbird. I love Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Ian McEwan. I mean, all of those people I read, and even people I read now, continuously inspire me to do better. I just finished a book that I was just so amazed by one passage of description. I was like jealous, you know, I just never wanted to write again. But then actually that means I want to write even better. So I'm continuously inspired by the things I find. I mean, I read every day, so, and I make that a point. Yes, you're good.
When you were younger with your writing, did you ever try writing like different genres? Like, did you ever try horror or mystery?
Yeah, I did, definitely. Well, yeah, I experimented with a lot of genres, especially, I probably have tried to write in almost every genre. But that's again, I mean, it's taken me a while to figure out where I kind of naturally end up going. But that said, I'm not particularly focused on genre itself. I mean, my first book is realistic fiction, my second book is dystopian fantasy, my third book is for kids. I just am writing an adult book now. Like, you know, I'm not that interested in writing within one genre. I'm just interested in stories, basically. Yes? Many. Well, you need a 3-act structure, basically. That's how every book is written. Act 1 ends with the inciting incident, which means a moment when everything changes. So, for example, when Katniss volunteers as tribute, when Bella meets Edward, when Romeo meets Juliet, or when, you know, to make up an example, when the girl that you thought would never move back to town suddenly moves back to town and she happens to know your deepest, darkest secret. I mean, those are inciting. It's the moment that things change, and that's what launches the rest of the book. Act 2 then progresses as a series of things that unfold because of that inciting incident. And Act 2 ends when everything seems like it will never resolve and everything's kind of crap. And then Act 3 is the resolution. So that's, I mean, you can find that in any plot book, but it's true. Pretty much every great book follows that structure with some complications. And you know, you need tension and you need characters that have wants. Your characters have to be after something. It's really boring to read about characters who don't want anything. So those are some of the basics of what you need. I don't think so. I don't know where they came from. That's still like one of the weirdest scenes I've ever written. Actually, when I was writing Delirium and I was writing that because it was at the beginning. And I was just like, what the hell am I doing? I was like, I can't believe I'm writing a scene with cows. But in my newest book, there's also a scene with animals. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just obsessed with herds of stampeding animals. That probably comes from my obsession. But sometimes you gotta make choices like that. Nobody ever wrote to me and said that was a really weird choice, which it's a weird choice, you know, but it works for that moment, so. Yeah, thank you. The question was, do I have a special room that no one can enter that I write in? No, I think you underestimate the smallness of apartments in New York, but no, I've tried really hard to actually not be fussy about that kind of stuff. Some writers have to have their computer with their special inspiration lamp and like certain kind of flowers. But the problem is then what would happen when I was on tour? You know, I've been on tour for a month. I just came from the Philippines. I don't have my special inspiration lamp with me. So I wouldn't be writing on those days, you know. So no, I can write anywhere. I can write in the back of a cab, I can write in a bathroom, and I've done it before. I can write on my BlackBerry by hand, whatever. So I've really tried to reduce that kind of preciousness about it. Some writers are just really like into the identity of being a writer. They like always wear shawls and have mug tea, and it's not really me.
To what extent have you or would you go to if you were like in just, I don't know, doing whatever, like eating lunch or out somewhere or on a trampoline, I don't know. So it's just something completely random and you had like a really good idea that you wanted to write about or put into your book, but you had nothing to
I would run to find something. I would break into a house if I needed to. I've run home like faster than I've ever sprinted before. After like 5 miles back home on the middle of a run, I've ruined 2 computers by rocketing out of the shower and just like banging on the computer totally with my hair, like pouring water into the keyboard. So I mean, I would go to some pretty long lengths. I've really offended people by being at dinner with them and leaving, but some things have to be sacrificed. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's happened in my face, but people will often tweet me like bad reviews, which I think is amusing. Which I just think is funny because it's like you have every right to hate my book, but why do you need me to see it? But yeah, I've had people say they hate my work. I've had people say they hate me, plain and simple. That the way that I have my career, people who don't know me will never meet me. The way that I've run my career, the choices I've made, just they do not like me. But I don't really care, That's one thing that I recommend for writers is to take a humiliating job. I worked for years in really disgusting nightclubs and where the patrons thought that it was fun to insult you. And so every single insult that you could possibly imagine or have heard, I've heard. And I just don't care at all.
If you could go back and tell yourself as a writer one thing.
Actually, I haven't been asked that before, which is surprising because I've been asked almost everything. I mean, I don't know. My writing habits were pretty good. I mean, I guess I would tell myself to go back and like keep, encourage myself to keep going because I did have rejections like everybody does. But I was already so hard-headed from years of rejection and hearing awful things anyway. I wasn't really ever discouraged. I didn't really ever believe that I wouldn't be able to do it, Yeah, I mean, writing exercises, I think, I don't usually give, I mean, I have a lot of writing prompts that are very specific. I could probably make some up now, but, one writing thing you can do, looking at an image, cool image, and trying to craft a story from behind it, or taking the first line of a book, just taking the first line and then riffing off of it completely and having that first line lead you to different places, preferably if the line is very active. Those can be good ones for kind of inspiring you. Yeah?
How old were you when you wrote your first story?
Oh, I don't know how old. I mean, my first story was like a 5-page, insanely stupid story about my cat Extra and how it had gotten that name because it had extra long ears and extra long tail. There wasn't a lot of narrative tension in that one. But I started trying to write my first novel when I was a freshman in high school, so that was when I was 13. And I finished my first novel when I was a senior in college, so when I was 21. So it took me that long between starting to try to write a novel and finishing my first novel. No, thankfully not. Yeah. The question was, have I ever been so far into a novel and then had to start over or delete it? And the answer was yes. So probably that happens to me fairly regularly. I would say that happens to me about half the time I write. And usually that happens around 30,000 words, which is about a third of the way into a novel, so 150 pages.
So is that the average? What's the furthest?
The furthest I've ever been and started over, well, I rewrote the 800-page novel twice from word one. So that was probably a 200,000 word novel.
How long does that take?
Wow.
It didn't take me that long, surprisingly. It took me about a year each time to write it. Year and a half.
That's not long at all, is it?
So when you say you rewrote one, you kept the themes in, or did
Yeah, I kept the themes, but I rewrote it from page one, word one.
Can you read your own books?
That's a great question. No, not really. I mean, yeah, I can. It depends on the time period, because when you've just finished it, you've seen it so much, and then you go on tour and you see it again and again and again, and you just get exhausted on it. I mean, I could read my own books now, but I know them inside and out, and there's so many other things to read I wouldn't choose to. But I read my books, and sometimes I often come across sentences, and I'm like, I can't believe I wrote this, it's so stupid, but but that's just sporadic. I don't read them and feel like, oh, this is bad. I feel as though I was writing the best book I could at the time. So several years later, I might not think it's that good, but I recognize that at the time I wrote it, it was the best I could do. So I'm not like embarrassed of my own books, you know what I mean?
Have you ever been really excited about a book and just stay on 4 just writing pages?
I'm not much of a stay-up all-nighter anymore, but yeah, but I try to avoid doing that because you get tapped out. Like, that's the thing, is that I try to write the same amount every day and only that amount, because the best thing you can do is be really excited about it and have somewhere to go. Like, stop yourself from, writing so that you're excited to pick it up again. That's why, you should always leave a party at the height of the party. You know what I mean? So you don't want to get to a point where you've exhausted everything you had to say in one night, and then you can never pick it up again, So I usually try to really stick with my writing limit.
Do you ever wake up in the morning and just think, I really don't want to pick up the pen?
Every day.
Or
Yeah, every day, pretty much.
why do you do it?
I mean, because it's what I do. I mean, it's necessary. And, I feel that way every day, but I know that once I do it, I'll feel great. I mean, it's like taking a run. I feel that way about running, too. I hate it. I would rather stay on the couch, but once I do it, I love it. And once I do it afterwards, I feel amazing. You know what I mean? It's just it takes a lot of discipline. It just takes discipline. But there's nothing, but at the same time, it's hard, but I get to do what I love for a living and travel around the world, and, it's worth it. It's totally worth it. Most things that are worth it and that bring you a lot of rewards in life are going to be hard. Otherwise, everybody would do it, and then you wouldn't be rewarded very well for doing it. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Do you get paid a bunch of money?
Yeah. Next question.
When you write, do you always plan out your story, so you just sort of start and keep writing?
I usually start and write about 30,000 words, which is about, actually a little bit less, probably 100 pages, to see if it's flowing, if it's working, if I'm loving it, and then I'll stop and force myself to outline, which is not really pleasant, but it's necessary for me, because otherwise I would write those 800-page novels without plot, So, and it's really good to troubleshoot then, as opposed to when you're 200 pages in and you realize that actually everything you've been planning is not working, and character X has to be a boy instead of a girl, and this and that. So I do force myself to outline after that point. Yeah. I didn't mean to sound rude in answer to your question. I just didn't want to focus on it, by the way. Oh, no, not you. The girl in the middle. Yeah. Yeah?
What is your
1,000 words. Yeah. Unless I'm editing, I have so many weird rules about it, though. 1,000 words unless I'm also simultaneously editing a book, in which case it's 500 words of writing and 20 pages of editing. And if I'm writing 2 books at the same time, it's 750 of the primary and 500 of the secondary. So it's totally arbitrary, but it just works for me.
Do you prefer type or handwrite?
I prefer computer because it just saves so much time. But if I'm really stuck on the computer, if I really don't want to do it that day, I'll write by hand because it feels less like official. So I get rid of some of the self-judgment, and then I can transcribe it later. But it's a big time suck to do it that way, so.
Yeah, I just want to know, like, with book sales, and nothing to do with the amount that you make or anything like that, but like, how does it work? Do you get paid according to all do you get paid according to the amount of books that you send off to bookshops, places that sell them, or do you get paid on the amount that they actually sell?
That's a really astute question, and I didn't know the answer to that question for a long time. Well, you get paid several ways. First of all, you get an advance, which means that, you know, if you sell a book to a publisher, the publisher gives you a sum of money. Let's say it's $10,000, which it wouldn't be, but, I mean, it could be, but, and then you have you also own a percentage of your books. And so it's kind of complicated, but basically you don't start making money on any amount of books that are sold or sent out until you've earned back your advance. So if you have also 10% royalties, and you know, you may only, for every book that gets sold, $1 of it goes back to paying your advance. And until you've reached 10,000, you won't even see any additional money. But actually you get paid basically, it's a complicated there's a complicated way of factoring it. It's neither one. You get paid basically on the amount sent out to bookstores minus the amount that they anticipate are going to get returned through years of having done this, basically.
Okay, alright.
It's very, like, Dark Ages. Very Dark Ages.
Would you ever think about romance?
Any romantic books? I think my books are very romantic, but not like romance books. I'm a cynical New Yorker. I mean, you know, I like romance, but I also like, you know, one thing that was important to me when I wrote Delirium, it's a book about love, but I wanted it to also be about friendship and about the love between families. I mean, when I was in high school, my relationship with my friends was so tight. And so I wanted it to be about that kind of love as well. So I don't think I'd ever write a straight romance, but romance is a part of life, so I definitely put it in my books. Yeah.
When you're like typing on the computer, like writing your books or whatever, do you ever find yourself easily distracted by like the internet?
Yeah, I mean, I can be. I mean, it's on the days that writing's really going well, no. Like on the days I start writing and I'm flowing, not really, but you know, that's why I never like pull up Facebook or have it behind my computer. I try to like not be online while I'm writing. I don't actually, some people go so far, there's actually apps and programs you can download that will not allow you to access the internet for a specific period of time. But I never really have to do that. Again, I mean, if I can find the discipline to sit down, I can usually find the discipline to then avoid like stalking my fiance on Facebook. So.
You ever had a sort of moment where you just see your father something in the idea like how to sing it, the story you write on people just was serious?
An idea that like kind of strong that I've never had anything that I felt I could write 50 books for. I mean, honestly, doing 3 books in a series almost killed me. So, I don't know. I mean, someday I'd really love to do kind of like a bigger fantasy epic, like some of the ones that I grew up reading, but so far, no. I mean, it's hard to write a trilogy. You have to live with the same characters for a really long time, and they're always in your head. It's not just like hanging out with the same people every day occasionally. So, I really don't understand how some people do it who write 8, 9, 10 books in a series. But maybe that will come as I get older, you know? Mm-hmm. I have tried to write a movie screenplay and really hated it. That's something, again, I would love to do in the future, but for now, I'm just all books. Like, that's really where my focus is. That's it. If no more questions, oh, yeah. Pasta, and my favorite condiment is ketchup, in case you're going to ask. And I haven't tried Vegemite yet, but I'm going to. I'm excited. Wait, I thought it was like an Australian thing. What? Really? Aren't you guys supposed to love it? Alright, anyway, on that note, thank you guys so much. Great.